Hello everyone, today we talk about hygiene in the Italian communes towards essentially the top of urbanistic development, not just in Italy but in the whole medieval civilization in the 13th century, so when we also have enough sources from the statutes, right? Numerous columns showing how communal governments were very sensitive to the needs of collective health, right? That were being made more concrete by the risks of epidemics that had multiplied since the end of the 13th century, as spaces were fundamentally overcrowded and health standards lowering due to famine. And the matter being particularly important because at this point in history there had never been anything like the endemic concentration to be found in the Italian city-states. There are also, for pre-industrial standards, very peculiar, as fundamentally the city population was at this point, end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, equal to the one of the surrounding district. Therefore, essentially, population was split equally between city and countryside. This was unknown before historically. Even Roman urbanism was very different, was much more, had a much lower endemic concentration. Even in there, of course, the overwhelming amount of people lived actually outside the city walls, as it was properly in the countryside, as it was normally in pre-industrial societies. This particular conjuncture that occurs in central northern Italy this time is, as we were saying before, a peak that fundamentally will not be reached again after the mid 14th century crisis up to essentially the modern age, right? But sometimes even later on, like during the 17th, the 18th century, and this is, or even the 19th in certain cases, and naturally, we can't explain how that occurred again, but that gives you a measure, properly, scholarly, of what this meant. And the reason being, naturally, that these were the wealthiest cities in the world, so people would flock in them. Historically, the population growth at this point, look at the rates of the 12th to 13th century, was enormous, right? And it had to do with immigration, not with natality. And the natality rate. So this meant that, as we've seen also in other videos, that cities were literally expanding, often building, in Italy especially, arriving to a second or a third city ring, right, compared to the older one, the Roman one often. And the objective was naturally incorporating and protecting all the suburbs that were forming outside the city, right? It was an important certification within the city proper, that here we can't discuss, but essentially there was a citizenry properly meant, and then another section of the population lived as a sort of clientelary subordinated state, especially at this point when technically it was mostly a socio-economical divide, naturally translated itself in a political and military sense, that was mirroring the increasing stratification of the social spectrum that would emerge eventually better in the 14th century with the masses of labor of workers mostly in the textile industries, of which Italy and Flanders present a proto-industrial dimension. Fundamentally would rebel, just like in the countryside, I don't know, in France, the Jacquerie would do, and then they were put down, right? These were lots of dispossessed people that lived fundamentally as a subsistency life quality, right? As a survival level, say, being fed with cheap, like with low protein and fat food, such as mostly bread, that was to support properly the mass, calorically speaking. That's in fact controlling the city supplies was fundamentally the function around which the Italian city-states developed around, right? This was crucial, and therefore in this massified reality where these people essentially work for someone else, for the great arts that were developing the government and investing all their wealth in these infrastructures, etc. Sometimes even at look at the great cathedrals of Europe, built started being built in the low Middle Ages, eventually blocked by the crisis of the mid 14th century and finished sometimes in the 19th, because the importance that there would be working sites open that could attract people. Then eventually, whether the infrastructure was finished or not was not the deal. The deal was attracting way more people that would consume more, that would pay taxes, that would activate the economy, and so on. And this, in fact, is technically a proto-industrial reality, right? Proper of the peak of medieval civilization that would, however, be characteristic a bit of late medieval urbanism and early modern one as well. Before the Industrial Revolution, that was naturally connected with the high degree of productivity. That is, as we will see today, also, all these activities that were concentrated in the cities required regulation, particularly because they were impressive. They were on an unprecedented scale. Like here, the largest industry, the arms and armor production, for example, was concentrated in the Milanese area. It was there was nothing so organized, centralized, regulated anywhere basically in the world, not just in Europe, and everything naturally was aimed at exports of this broader internationalized economy. And in the process, you understand that this is to be seen also if you study the crisis of the 14th century, the collapse of the great Tuscan banks, etc., and how impetuous naturally medieval growth had been, and how there were not really fallback plans, let's say, in a security sense, in an answering sense, that were eventually to be restructured later on after the crisis, etc., mostly revolving around land assets. But at this point, even the problem of famine was a big deal, because naturally agriculture was still at the base of real economy, and playing the most important role. But it's obvious that very wealthy cities here could literally buy grain from somewhere else, right? And others that maybe were ousted during the crisis that normally struck at, across the region, like throughout all the continent sometimes, would had the worst of it. And all these masses sometimes literally starving to death, and even the Black Death has been read not much like a cause, but as a consequence as well of such state of things, where there were so many masses with also lower properly immunitary resistance, given as we've seen, their diet, their living conditions, etc. You can imagine what the suburbs are today. We'll look at even properly not much the misery, but the environmental pollution that existed in these realities, hygiene, etc. And let's say that the desire to improve the quality and beauty of the city was an important objective posed owned by communal governments, right? And there was properly an ideological dimension to it, properly the beauty, the prosperity, right? There are lots of sources at the time praising the cities, their wealth, their power, etc. Rightfully so, because these were true states, differently from essentially other European cities that were towns provided with some, dynamism, etc. regulated. These were properly statal realities within the city gates, right? And enormously so, properly bite-sized. And at that point, public health would pose imperatives, right, aside from the rhetoric that we must try to understand, because it's not really clear, even through the sources, the extent of such problems. But we understand that they were present, and that communal government was invested and involved in fixing them. It's like we're living in similar times in terms of after a great moment of of development, of prosperity. There's a lack of regulation and environmental problems, etc., that we sometimes close an eye in front of, right? And here in late communal Italy, something similar happens. The statutes of Ferrara of 1287 state that the regulations relating to the cleaning of the streets aimed at the, quote, better health of the inhabitants and appearance of the city, what would be the decorum, so broadly meant. This goes in parallel with other provisions, such as the ones of paving the streets, right? Which also is, the Italian city ahead of the times for, and it will make a video specifically too. So just also against the cinematographic representation of straw and mud in the street. No, not all the Middle Ages is the standard average what we see modeled on 15th century Northern European. Medieval civilization was something way more advanced than we normally. What we understand, however, is that it was extremely difficult to maintain hygiene in such agglomerations of unusual dimensions, as we've seen for the time, and think properly about here not the technological dimension, this the lack of medical and modern medical understanding of things like that, but properly what was the cost, right, for a society like that in relative terms from a political and social point of view. Always think about this. There is nothing, let's say, that is resolved purely by science. Science is just getting the info and then acting upon that. And in order to act upon that, you have to move things politically, socially. Otherwise, technology can remain there and being useless, as it constantly happens historically until there is an adequate doctrine of application. And this is, as you understand, in medieval times, the most elementary gestures, like throw out the garbage, ensure the potability of water. Think even hear the difference between the one that is used normally not considered just to drink or to cook with or to work with, right? Or to simply get water. Getting water is like we are used mostly historically. Think about the Roman aqueducts, but as we've seen, these cities were by far much larger, and people in people lived in them. So think about the cost that was unprecedented historically, and this posed technical, human, financial problems that the communes struggled to solve, and it wasn't easy too. So indeed, one may get the impression that while administrations were constantly trying to contain the increasing waste and pollution in overpopulated cities, albeit with measures whose effectiveness, as we will see, may raise doubts, citizens preferred to adapt, as they just do today, in fact, to the precariousness of the situation and pretended not to see, right? I like to stress the parallelism with modern days because not just we are, you see, my position, climate change is a very widely debatable thing in terms of properly what to do with it, because again, that's the problem. First of all, we don't even clearly understand what's the behind it, but I'm way more, and that's becoming a sort of religion. I am much more understandably concerned by pollution. Like, that is, if you pollute water at the point that there are microplastics that you can't even properly filter and you get tumors in the process and you start dying, let's say, how many people talk about this? Like, yeah, okay, there are people talking about that, plastics in the ocean, etc., but we're not bombarded every day. Whereas a simple phrase like climate change has come to equate, let's just who knows what's going to happen, the world will end, with changes that frankly have always existed in some degree, and also, especially in relative terms, in much more devastating ways towards, for example, these civilizations in the past, and that today we can have, in relative terms, more means to stemming their consequences, at least because that's what appears politically and scientifically the most sensible thing to do. But other things are really a concern. But most people just turn their head and don't care, because here we make on this channel like a quest for civilization, and we kind of have faith in human intelligence. But the truth being that most things like this is clear by history of economics and technology, that most improvements do not come because somebody wakes up on one day, decides the thing, everybody accepts to fix a thing and to make a leap forward. No. The history of the development of human civilization is just essentially putting a patch on a disaster, as long as it presents. Just look at the pandemics, right? We're completely unprepared, like lots of other things. And so the actual positive capacity to predict and apply a change effectively is ridiculously insignificant in the history of human, the human race. Now, this was a bit the problem. Like, the garbage compared to world where people literally, this was partly a problem of the health issues in the first place, but as we've seen, not everything, right? First of all, people had, didn't have modern medicines, they didn't have vaccines and so on, and they would get sick anyway, and there were wars constantly ravaging these communities, destroying the countries. Let's say, living next to garbage was maybe one of the smallest problems in perspectives to all the things that constantly happen in these realities. And I stress here, we made a lot of videos on communal Italy. These city-states were constantly at war. Like there wasn't just like one war, at one point, like in some years, and then no, these were constantly active and constantly harassing each other, their countryside, their supply lines. It was a freaking mess, right? And when you study sources, you realize that authors, in fact, you have always to think about the motivations. What were they writing about the cities? There's a flourishing municipal literature developing naturally in communal Italy that exalted the city's prosperities, as we were saying before. And none of these cities' descriptions, even the most precise and full of technical details, such as that of Milan, for example, made by Bonvesin de la Riva, mentions hygienic problems and their possible solutions. And you may wonder why. Like, was it too trivial of a problem, or didn't it look, nice, positive, brilliant about it? Right. Well, evidently, they had to coexist with a reality that, aside from the prosperity of these centers, was still the average medieval one, right, for that matter. So, first of all, it's a matter of mentality. Secondly, of the reasons of properly why these works were written. In any case, under the conditions we know, the hymn sung by these authors to the purity of the water and the transparency of the air is meaningful, because even if it makes the reader somewhat skeptical, it still talks about things that were evidently praised, such as having properly, pure water. Often these cities were, we were mentioning Milan before. Milan was a crossed, and still today actually, but at the time even more by channels. Like, I can't say like Venice, because naturally it's a different thing, but this full of them was all, they served properly also not just trade, which was the primary function, but also these hygienic problems. And the idea of having pure water and clean air, right, was even at the time praised as well, right? We don't think about this much. We think about the Middle Ages as the purity of nature, etc. Yes, living in those times, looking at the sky without much of a pollution, etc., would have been fantastic. The green of the countryside, etc. But cities were dirty, objectively, like any human settlement at the time. Hygienic conditions were disgusting, as a matter of fact. As we go on, like, if you are on the digestion, please stop the video, because we're getting into something not particularly disgusting, but still maybe hurt your belly sensitivity at this point. Now, the so was still in the absence of references to the problem, still we can still perceive the appreciation towards a healthy environment, of course. Because technically, they didn't know about microbes and all this stuff, but they understood, they connected the idea that filth brought disease and stuff like that. So they weren't completely unaware of such things, aside from superstitions, etc. There was always a reasonable side that had spotted naturally the connection by a degree. Even though everything happened because God and because of the behavior of Christians and so on. Now, the cleanness of the city was based on collective effort, naturally. As we were saying before, these were statal societies. The statutes do not cease to remember that every citizen was responsible, at risk of a fine, by the way, for the decorum of the trait of road, of street, of which his house overlooked. They also spell out in detail the things everyone must and must not do to keep the city clean and in good repair. Among the most often reiterated prescriptions, there is the one that prohibits throwing waste and black water from windows and leaving the carcasses of animals on public roads. This is especially, these are all issues that you find in still in the second modern age and beyond, right? Even in Europe, there are certain city streets when you find this written properly by the government on the walls, etc., because it was somewhat normal. I don't know, you have a horse or a dog where it dies and it remains on the street, and they threw everything outside. So you can't imagine the living conditions of what this guy. You could find there are some, look at some places in the world, even still today. You have, I don't know, there are corpses of random people, funerals in the street. Now there are these kind of promiscuities. There are huge, properly administrative problems relative to this. Look at certain, I don't want to mention specific countries, but I think we have an idea of what we're referring to if you have looked at the world. But that can make you understand what it was like. There was a great promiscuity in the way people lived, even with the animals and so on. For example, there are issues that limits the breeding of pigs and their movement within the city. Which was normal. You would walk in in an ancient or medieval city. At some point, would be a herd of pigs, all hoinking, and passing by you. And what could you do, right? Think about properly. You see, these areas compared to. It's funny what there are romantic people who believe that these were somewhat times in which everything was orderly. There was a hierarchy and obedience or authority. If somebody studies, of course, the political realities of this world that were constantly unstable. That is, here, as we were saying before, it was already a big deal if the city-states could maintain internal order and cohesion between plots, coups, and all, clashes between various families, or the people against the aristocrats and so on. And you can imagine what was the capacity probably of the government to enforce this thing. And actually, in late communal Italy, this thing gets increasingly more regulated and actually effective, right? Even properly the capacities of police force, we will see it at some point. And the communes began to requisite weapons to stock catapults to sweep the cities, the narrow city streets from rioters, things like that. There are very interesting and bloody and fascinating. I studied them, in particular military details to this stuff that is very fascinating. Other regulations, however, concerning hygiene says that wells, fountains, and streams had to be protected from pollution. And again, that the same polluted activities were regulated. First of all, those of the tanners, the dyers, the butchers that needed to get rid of their, let's say, relics and to have often also current water passing by. And all the communes therefore envisaged the establishment of specialized magistracies aimed at monitoring the application of these rules. These magistracies are also often charged with repressing attempts to occupy public space, not surprisingly. So here, that's why I mentioned before police force, because it was part of the same enforcement measures, right? Means of coercion from public authority that passed through armed forces. And at the time, really, punishments could be really severe, as you understand. Hygiene rules provided for by the statutes are often placed, however, at a more basic level, also because not all cities were communes, let's say, but were properly developed in the same way. We made videos about the genesis of Italian communes, the differences between properly the origins, let's say. There were smaller centers as well, aside from these roughly 30 big properly civitates, as in the Latin term of properly Roman, cities, properly meant also from an infrastructural point of view as imposing thing. There is, for example, a statute of the small Venetian town of Bassano, dating to 1295, for example, prohibiting urinating and defecating under the arcades of the streets, and throwing waste there, but authorize everyone to accumulate the manure produced by the stables in front of the house, on condition to dispose and clean every 5 days, right? And this was more like a town, not a city, right? So you understand here even the closeness with the stables. Cities had the same thing objectively, but it was a less compressed space, and therefore needs were less impellent. The need to keep the public space, that is streets and squares, clean, actually collides with the lack of means, rather, but also against the needs of individual hygiene. For example, the statutes of Bassano forbid the inhabitants to install latrines in their homes because their drainage would risk polluting the streets and drinking water. This is important because, as you know, also well studied, they have to be placed in areas where there are no infiltrations from surrounding pits and so on. Now, perhaps tolerable in some small semi-rural centers, this head-turning policy becomes unsustainable in large cities. Some, such as Vicenza in 1264, seek an intermediate route by authorizing the latrines but forbidding them to be connected to public networks, which requires the owners to keep the evacuation pits themselves. Industrial pollution. Yes, to use a slightly anachronistic term, but as we've seen, there is a proto-industrial dimension of economical activity in these contexts, poses other problems when the development of productive activities increases, and especially specific ones, like we've seen before. A recurring response is to group the jobs that dirty the most on the edge of the city, right? A bit like the industries in the periphery today, right? That's the same reason for industrial times. There is properly a branch of history of urbanistics that tells us that, right? And eventually there is a further gentrification in some outer, areas that because the center becomes too. There are dynamics like this too. At some point, we will have to address, but the most important aspect, especially, was to concentrate this crafts near the outward-facing waterways. Thus, in 1252, the commune of Bologna concentrated industrial furnaces, metal foundries, dyeing plants, and paper mills on the southern outskirts of the city, next to the Savena River. In fact, these provisions turned out to be inapplicable starting from 1259, and many of these activities then began to move towards the northern suburbs on the banks of the Reno, a river initially reserved for wheat mills and for fitting the navigable canal. And in the process, you understand how the economical interests here were, sorted out with a hierarchy based on priority, etc. The Commune of Florence, that was literally the richest city in the world and had some of the most active textile industry. We made a video recently about this too. Conducted a similar policy by making some land and also buildings located on the banks of the Arno in the suburbs available to polluting trades. Most cities, however, had sewers that led to house drainage systems. The statutes of Parma, for example, prescribe in detail in 1255 the connection of the houses to the public sewer system, ordering that the whole complex be covered. So this was done privately in part. Consider that many parts of the cities were fundamentally ruled by individual arts that had their own statutes regulating life within them. So there was here a boundary. It was not a fully statalized reality. This is literally Western states being born, and therefore there was always a graduality of like how much did the public take care of that, and how much was it private, because also in terms of sources that here are very abundant, and at least not for everything we would like to know, but comparatively to many realities, they show very well the intersection between public and private dimension. But most of these, as we've seen even in the praises of the cities, like most of these things would be considered to be taken care of privately, and that therefore it's albeit public authority, as we've seen, regulated this action, still it was considered something that was going on its own, right? So never consider an unregulated reality as necessarily as if there was nothing behind that was taken care of privately. This is very important in the history of law. We've seen it also in very different contexts from these ones. Many things were taken care of privately, also in terms of, people's behavior, how they, future, and how even the division between sexes, the different careers, things that much was properly part of the system, that if things worked, was not in need to make things work. Every time you find a regulation, you know that there's a problem there, right? It's not just anecdotal. The concern to bury the sewers, to have them underground, is general in the statutes, right? However, it is not possible to specify how wide these networks were. Some scholars judge them in general to have been insufficient, but there are lots of mysteries about this too, and properly about sometimes even some of the most important things. For example, the wells of Siena, that stands on a hill fundamentally where there is no water, and that we know that since a very early time, given the development of the city, by the way, the medieval engineers built there something underground that got the water, and sometimes we don't know where does this water come from. It's sometimes a bit of a mystery, and these are the secrets, let's say, of medieval technology, because that they would know that we wouldn't, and that they made things work well. So there is probably, digging underneath these centers that were, eventually urbanization went on, and etc. in a modern sense would cost a lot, and we don't know literally everything about that. That is, if we could dig under every space in Europe, in a European city, at this point we would easily multiplicate by hundreds our archaeological understanding. We would discover a completely different history by lots of terms, right? And it's a very overlooked aspect, but it costs and it can't be done always. But relatively to these problems, still the example of Parma can work. Its statutes of 1308 let us know that there is no street that is equipped with them. and that the streets in fact are so full of rubbish that it is difficult to walk there. This we know from the statutes of 1325. And 1325 wasn't such a good time for Parma, by the way. So consider also the dysfunctionality of like if this city is under siege and is being about to be wiped out, or is squeezed by by military expansion. This was most of the problem at that point, by a foreign power that is going to install or has already installed its seigneury over it, etc. There is essentially a failure of public government. This is especially the case of Parma, where eventually seigneury, first domestic, eventually foreigner, takes over, and there is literally a collapse of administration, and at that point also infrastructures and order and everything kind of sinks, right? And also misery increase, because literally we have to think. I think in you see there is a lot of interest for at least in a certain sectors of people, that especially those that play role games or things like that, they have to fix a standard of what the typical medieval life was, what were their tools or because they think that there is something medieval in the first place. But aside from the material aspects that are, if you want to listen important, do realize what these people, as we were saying before, went through. Like what it meant for a city like this, for example, to have to pay constantly its own troops, its own soldiers, in the face of the onslaught of major seigneurial leagues that were harassing it and destroying its countryside. It was eroded by the exiles that were cutting exactly the supplies of to the cities by devastating the cultivations or seizing them, and sometimes properly blocking even the river access to certain trades, and getting stuff was becoming more difficult, and then people were indebted themselves. The commune was making loans and loans to try to pay debts because of military expenses, and people got poor, and there were all these refugees from the countryside that had their houses destroyed, and the whole freaking public government is collapsing, and there are rebellions, and people don't want to pay taxes anymore, also because they don't have money anymore. So you think that, if you were evaluating, and this is everyday history in the 20s and the 30s of Parma, if you want to evaluate this specific of lifestyle, whatever, you have to put on the fore what is obviously the single most important aspect of this all: politics, society, war, right? Then how people made things materially comes second, right? You have to think what is the bigger picture, otherwise you remain sclerotized in a narrower mindset that doesn't serve any historical purpose at this point in historiography especially. Now, there are also other literary references of sort, like, for example, as a novel narrated by Boccaccio in the Decameron, revealing that in Florence, in the heart of the city, there were large open-air landfills. Right? This is another thing we have forgotten about up to very recent past. There were literary areas. Sometimes in Rome, historically, in Roman times, there is an entire hill present in modern notes, and it was created by landfill, by throwing the amphoras, the vases, things like that. This thing formed a freaking hill, and where there are houses to this was the romantic. Consider that spaces were also open spaces were not so numerous, right? So the ones that were more available sometimes were filled at a close distance for a compressed population lived concentrated in much narrower spaces than today's. And these landfills, interestingly enough, were also emptied by the farmers periodically in order to fertilize the fields. Another novel tells instead that the streets that separated the houses served as spaces where accumulate waste. There were, however, more or less advanced city policies and infrastructures in that enucleate a more diversified picture here and there. Pavia, for example, had very perfected sewers, described with enthusiasm by Opicino de Canistris around the 30s of the 14th century. This was also a very ancient network. And there is a difference also in not necessarily what is older is worse, especially considering what we were saying before, that development had gone ever faster, right? So at that point you have ever more difficulties to regulate it. Whereas the earlier times, I don't know, the 11th, the 12th centuries, etc., were times in which the city was growing less impetuously, was less subjected in general, maybe not the city by itself, but let's say the whole system was less, because they were also rocketing at that time, but the system was less invested by other systemic factors, and therefore there was, let's say, more care, more regulation, also more uniformity. Consider that by the 12th century, the Italian citizenry of the communes was much more, let's say, equal in political participation, in a sense, right? Not that was much more even, like, let's say, not the citizenry proper, because some people didn't properly have such control in the city, but let's say that the government was much more compact, more uniform. By the 13th and 14th century, there are new elites that come and create something different. There is a great change, and not all in this process was. This is what actually brought the needs to statalize, to centralize, to control this better. But at the same time, this often passed also through certain forms of privatization that not necessarily thought much of the broader, like in ancient times, the well-being of the cities in a strong municipal form, but rather, this big arts that were corporations that were essentially, ruling the city now on their control, and then all these other masses, as we've seen, that were immigrating for working hard for them. Who cares about them? It was an increasing divide, right? And this is a bit the story of late medieval Europe in the first place. Ever fewer but richer people that rule over way more and poorer people. Right? Never think that the Renaissance was a moment when people got better in relative terms, in terms of more equality. This is a positivistic, I even call it neo-Protestant delusion. The modern age has nothing to do with that. The modern age was the establishment of the ancien regime as we know it, of properly the real oppression, not that didn't quite exist in the Middle Ages as we know it. But not necessarily because things were working worse in a scalar sense, but as the modern age shows, the systemic shortcomings like the ones of famines, this broader international, market fluctuations, etc., that were proper of a more advanced world, however, would produce systematically some parts of the population to get chronically poor and marginated. And you know how this was starting being in the Middle Ages. It was normal to have mendicants in the streets. It was part of the broader temper of the times, right? It was normal for in modern times. The vagabonds, the very often veterans, violent people, drunkard, thieves, all together. Also mentally ill people were increasingly more segregated, marginated, enclosed properly in suburbs, in areas that were slums, right? And this thing starts passing, sadly enough, through the same development, however, of a more advanced world, of a better world for arguably in absolute terms, but that in relative terms to some people got dramatically worse. And we still live, in a sense, in this reality, right? And things are not really going so much better in that regard, in relative terms at least. In absolute terms, there is no comparison. We live in the most prosperous time that the history of mankind has ever seen, without even, needing to prove it factually, because reality speaks by itself. Now, we stop it here. I just hope that, so we will keep talking naturally about a bit of these issues for other realities of hygiene in medieval times, but also about the infrastructural development of Italian communes. For now, however, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.